The planned release of 6,000 federal inmates at the end of October is just the start. Prisoners in the coming release, first reported by the Washington Post on Tuesday, will be transferred to halfway houses or home confinement before being freed entirely.
It's not something that has been dropped unexpectedly on America. We've known about this for more than a year. But at a time when we are locked once again in the never-ending and seemingly no-answer gun debate, a time of major cities in America, some exasperated with the rise in crime, and people beginning to wonder how safe law enforcement can keep them, 6,000 federal prisoners will be released and hit the streets at the end of this month. Why now? And how will putting people on the streets with no skills and little chance at employment fit into the overall picture? Let's get to it. Our guest is eminently qualified to speak on these issues. Former Attorney General, now Dean at the Belmont University College of Law in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Alberto Gonzales, back to the Hard Line. Dean, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and I want to begin right away with the prisoners being released. When you hear that 6,000 federal prisoners will be released, even though many of them are perhaps low-level drug offenders, that scares America right now. Should it?
I think the natural reaction to that kind of news, of course, is one of concern, hesitancy, questioning whether or not this is the right approach. Of course, this follows a great deal of study by the Sentencing Commission, which is charged by statute to help Congress and help the executive branch develop the appropriate policy relating to sentencing and criminal justice generally. And the decision was made by the Sentencing Commission that there should be shorter sentences for drug offenders. And so as the introduction indicated, this is something that's been known for a while. If, in fact, Congress was unhappy with this, they certainly could have done something about it. The president could have done something about it. And so we are where we are today. And from my perspective, the key is whether or not this is something that can be done in a way that ensures that only those drug offenders that are not going to be a threat to society, not going to be a burden to society, can we accomplish that? And that remains to be seen. But I certainly understand the concern that the average American citizen would have about this news, and we'll have to just wait and see how it all plays out.
When you talk about that, the release of these prisoners, what they're in for, are we perhaps too PC, the president, Congress? They don't want to touch this for whatever reason and dig deeper into this and make sure that the people who are out will not be a detriment to society. This scares a lot of people because, let's face it, a lot of things fall through the cracks in the government, and I think people are afraid that this will be one of those.
Well, there's no question about it, but that's a chance you take even for someone who serves out the entirety of their sentence. You know, when they get out, are they going to commit a crime? Do they have the skills to cope successfully in society? Will they be a burden on society? So this is a problem that we face every day with respect to anyone who's incarcerated. In terms of whether or not this is appropriate PC. Look, the truth of the matter is part of the motivation here is that we've got prison overcrowded. We're way overcrowded in our federal prisons, and I think a decision has been made by the Sentencing Commission and accepted by the Congress and the President. This is an appropriate way to deal with this. If we've got people who have served a sufficient amount of time, and we believe they're not going to be a threat to society, believe they're not going to be a burden to society, then they should be released. And so, again, the key is whether or not the process will produce a result that everyone hopes will be produced, but that remains to be seen.
Let me ask you then, why are we so overcrowded? Is there greater crime in America? Is it the crackdown? I mean, there has to be a reason why we are burgeoning at the seams in our prisons.
Well, some people would say it's because of our mandatory sentencing laws that we've had in place for a number of years, and that people are being incarcerated when perhaps a better alternative, particularly for youth, is to put them in, say, a drug court plan. So I think some people believe that it is our sentencing policy that has resulted in this terrible prison overcrowding. And when you think about our limited resources today, talking about the federal debt, the federal deficit, I think the truth of the matter is people don't want to spend more money on prisons. I think it's a much better use of our money to spend it on education, to spend it on rehabilitation, to spend it on training.
If you don't mind, let me go ahead and stop you there, because you've actually hit on something I was going to ask you about. Let me stop you at that point there. is the bigger issue here that we are releasing people of all ages out of prison. We don't give them any skills to cope. If they're in for more than 6 months, they come out with no jobs. Their educational level hasn't been improved any. I mean, I hate to do this, but I go back to a time when prisons actually had things that people learned inside prison. They learned trade. They had to do something. Now we just set them free. They're stuck out there, no job. They come right back out. They're part of the system again. We're paying for them in taxes. Isn't this the biggest problem that we face right now? This is the issue.
Well, I certainly have no objection. In fact, I would support a greater effort, a greater spending of federal dollars to provide retraining, rehabilitation, so that these people can come back into our society and become productive members of our society. I think that is a very important point of that. Some people believe that is not an appropriate role for our criminal justice system. I happen to disagree with that. I do believe that would be an important and appropriate role.
Let me then go ahead and push to something else, and we're talking about crime here. And that is the gun issue in America that continues to go around, and it always comes back to the same place. Senate Democrats are talking about reforms, closing background check loopholes, expanding the background check database, tightening regulations on illegal purchases. Dean, we've been here before. Every single time we have shootings, we say the same things over and over again. In your opinion, what's the linchpin? What's the one thing that's got to be done to help turn this around?
Well, we've got to do more than talk. That's for certain.
I'm with you there.
There's been a lot of talk about what we should do in reaction to a senseless shooting that we just saw recently in Oregon. And there have been far too many of these kinds of shootings. I, for one, would not be adverse to increasing the number of transactions, the types of transactions that would be subject to background checks. That is not totally the answer, but I think most Americans don't have a problem with the idea of having legitimate background checks with certain provisos from my perspective. One is that we ensure that the database is complete and that it's accurate. Two, we ensure that the database cannot be used, the information in the database cannot be used for any other purpose. I don't want the federal government having access to this information, who owns guns, and being able to use it for some other purpose. So from that perspective, I don't have a problem with increasing the number of transactions that would be subject to a background check. I don't think it should be 100%. For example, if I want to give my son a gun, should not be subject to a background check. I think for an occasional sale, someone sells a gun to a neighbor, that shouldn't be subject to a background check. But if you're in the business of selling weapons, even if you're not a federally licensed firearm dealer, and you go to a gun show, for example, I don't have no problem and would support subjecting those kinds of transactions to background checks. And that is a particular problem on our southern border, where you have these gun shows, you have sales made by people that are not federally licensed dealers, and therefore these sales are made without background checks, and they all go across the border. These guns go across the border, and they are a major source of the crime in Mexico. And so I have no problem with that. But again, that is not the sole answer. We also have to deal with the fact that many people today that are engaged in these kinds of crimes have mental health issues. And we live in a society today where we respect other people's privacy.
If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and stop you there for a second. I've only got 90 seconds left. Two very quick questions here, though. When you talk about mental health, do we not need to include deeper mental health examinations as part of being able to purchase a weapon? Do we not need to know this before we put a gun in somebody's hand?
Yes. And the key is finding the right balance between protecting that person's privacy and also getting the information that's legitimate in making a calculation as to whether this is someone that should have access to a firearm.
Here's the second thing. In Iowa on Tuesday, Hillary Clinton said that the way the National Rifle Association views the Second Amendment is all wrong. Here's what she said.
I am very determined that we are going to try to bring some sanity back so that people's Second Amendment rights are protected. They're not absolute the way the NRA wants them to be.
I've got about 30 seconds left. In your opinion, is the NRA the big problem here in getting something done?
No, I think it's primarily education, but I think even the NRA accepts the facts that the Second Amendment is not absolute. It's not a constitutional issue in terms of background checks, for example. The Supreme Court has already said the Second Amendment does allow reasonable restrictions, for example, background checks with respect to owning a firearm. So, the Supreme Court has already answered that. This is not a constitutional question. It's a question of policy. What is the right policy with respect to gun ownership in America?
And I would guess that probably the one thing that dismays you the most is, as you said at the beginning, All we're doing is talking these days, and no one is really doing anything. That always seems to be where we bring ourselves in this circle. Dean, and I say that very respectfully as well, Alberto Gonzales, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll talk again. Take care. It is an issue which he points out is not necessarily, it's not about one thing, it's about a number of things. At the end of the show, in telling it like it is, my commentary, I will deal on something else that we need to do to make this country a lot safer. Stay with us. The fastest 60 minutes in news continues.